Good evening and welcome to Plain Talk. My name is Christopher Ram. Thank you for joining us for the next hour as we discuss a business's view of house-to-house registration. For these discussions are Mr. Kit Nascimento on my extreme left and Captain Gerald Gouveia, who is chairperson of the Private Sector Commission. Gentlemen, welcome to Plain Talk.
Thank you, Chris.
Before I start the program, Captain Gouveia, I want to address a direct question to you. You were the subject of a scathing attack by Mr. Desmond Trotman, a WPA Granger appointed GCOM commissioner. Some things I prefer not to repeat on this program. Freddie Kissoon came to your defense. What did you do?
Well, first of all, I wanted to forgive him, for he know not what he speaks.
That's Desmond Trotman.
Yes. Because those who know me would find his comments completely.
Well, it wasn't only about you; it's about your parents as well.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
It was a racist attack that treated with Jerry not as a Guyanese, but as some sort of white slave master. It was disgusting. It was deplorable. It was unforgivable. And he should be made to resign from the commission. That is my opinion.
Is he fit and proper to be a member of GCOM? A person who has to take an irracial position in making decisions, Jerry?
I was personally very taken back by his comments, but he is a government appointee to GCOM, and I would have wanted to believe that GCOM commissioners would stay away from that kind of foul and inappropriate behavior and language. And I would imagine
any Guyanese, any public figure.
You know, it's important to note that he signed the letter as a GCOM commissioner. And it's important to note it was on WPA letterhead.
Mm-hmm.
So it's clearly
a party that you were part of.
A WPA position, and he was clearly writing as a GCOM commissioner.
Do you believe he should have been sanctioned by GCOM itself, or he should have been recalled by President Granger, who appointed him?
I cannot imagine that President Granger would in any way sanction that kind of behavior.
But by his inaction?
I'm not aware whether it's come to the attention of the President, but we have written to the
Ethnic
Relations Commission, bringing it to their attention and asking them to deal with it appropriately. When I say we, the Private Sector Commission.
Should a letter not be sent to GCOM itself? If, as you say, Kit, he signed as a GCOM commissioner?
I think probably that's an option, but we preferred at the moment to write as we've done. We released our letter to the press, but none of the newspapers carried it because they say that Trotman's letter was so appalling that they never carried Trotman's letter. Therefore, they didn't want to carry our response to it.
Mm-hmm. The only person,
which is good journalism, but I think maybe the Times carried it.
The only newspapers that carried, I believe, was the Chronicle. But you know what's ironical about this? That
no, the Chronicle carried
Trotman's
letter, but did
not yours.
Did not.
Which is, I don't think you would call that good journalism.
But don't start me on the Chronicle, please.
Okay. Yes, Jerry.
No, I was saying that, for people who knew me, I grew up in the Guyana National Service. I served Guyana in the Army. I served with President Granger. And I don't believe that I've ever been, that kind of language have ever been used to describe me before. And people who know me know what my own involvement in Guyana. So that was, It was, in fact, very shocking. But you know what? And he wrote me as Jerry Gouveia writing this letter. And I think people need to understand the Private Sector Commission really, while I endorse everything in that letter, and the words of that letter represented the views of the private sector across this country. And I don't, for 1 minute, not take responsibility for the letter, but certainly it was not a personal letter from Jerry Gouveia to Lowingfield. This was a letter from the Private Sector Commission.
Yes.
Across this country.
Which is what sparked Desmond
That's correct. That's correct.
Reaction.
But he wrote it almost as if it was a personal issue. And myself and Lowingfield actually have always worked together. We worked together in the Army. We worked together in GCOM for the last 20 years. And we have an excellent working relationship.
Now, this program is business's view of house-to-house registration. It's clearly taken on a political dimension. Is the PSC getting involved in politics?
I mean, of course.
Well, I don't know how you answer that question, because anything that the Private Sector Commission does has to do with the country.
Yeah. But is it a political stand you're taking?
No, not at all. Not at
but
all.
I was going
Sure,
on to
go on.
say that the Private Sector Commission must, of its very nature, address political issues. Because political issues affect the development, the economy, the functioning of business. Any organization representing the private sector must, by its very nature, have to address issues which are political. And by that I mean not party political positions, but national political positions. And indeed, the conducting of house-to-house registration is a national issue. It's not a party issue.
What is its implication for business, though, and relevance?
Well, let me take that, Kit. Let me take this and say to you first of all, people obviously have not been following the activities of this private sector. We have been back 2001 with GCOM, and in fact in 2011, I will just tell you that in 2011, after those elections, the opposition at the time started a protest to call for the SOPs, that GCOM must present their SOPs to them. And I remember the chairman of GCOM refused to give them the SOPs because he said the same SOPs that he got, they got. And myself and Kit led a delegation down to GCOM in 2011, when we negotiated and talked to GCOM about the possibility of scanning all the SOPs onto a CD and giving it to the opposition so that they could do whatever checks they wanted. And so the private sector have always inserted ourselves into these issues, not to take political sides, but to bring some kind of finality and some kind of normalcy to the situation, which we did.
You asked what it has to do with business. It has to do with the holding of elections.
Mm-hmm.
The electing of a government is a very important aspect of the conducting of free, fair means of putting into office a government that represents the will of the people. If you have a government that does not represent the will of the people, then you have a government that represents anything but that. Then you have a government that may very well be unlawful.
Or at least dictatorial and autocratic.
That is why the Private Sector Commission has always played a very critical and integral part in the monitoring of elections. And we've mounted significant teams to do that. And we have been recognized officially by GCOM in that regard.
And you've had, I recall a couple of elections, you practically functioned as something of a command center in which the
Correct.
diplomatic community...
We are accredited observers by GCOM. We have actually fielded almost 2,000 observers with the EAB across Guyana. So we've always worked with GCOM. But what I want to say to you about something that is important is this. In 2006, when we were going into those elections, the PNC at the time had made the claim that they wanted a system to verify the lists. That is the NRR. And coming out of those discussions came the need for biometrics.
Yeah, I will get there, Jerry.
Okay.
We got some time.
Okay, good.
Because we're talking about the the Private Sector Commission's role,
Okay.
and whether on this issue, you make the point, Kit, you make the point, Jerry, that this in fact a national issue, it's governance issue, constitutional issue, but yet you have been accused of being pro-PPP in this matter. Is such an accusation or label justified? And can it be understood in the context that many of the positions you're taking reflect those of the PPP?
Well, you know, when you take positions of a national nature on the conducting of elections, they're going to reflect the position of one party or the other. But it doesn't mean to say that you are pro that
Well, not
party.
necessarily only one. It could be some of one and some of the other.
Exactly. Yes, the People's Progressive Party have declared their position against the holding of house-to-house registration.
You should speak up.
But they've done that for what we consider to be a good reason. And one of the reasons is that in conducting a house-to-house registration, you place the Elections Commission in a position which will be in violation of the ruling of the CCJ. And if anything, the private
And
sector...
that's as in connection with the motion of no confidence.
Exactly,
Of
course.
And the decision by the
All of
CCJ.
all of this that is taking place follows from the no confidence motion.
Yes.
The moment there was a no confidence motion, we are constitutionally bound to hold elections. We're constitutionally bound to hold those elections within 3 months.
Or such long a period as the
As-
Parliament by 2/3 majority.
Exactly. So we have been, from the time the no confidence motion was passed in the National Assembly, we have been put in election mode.
Or, yes.
The country has.
But the government didn't think so.
Well, I am not expressing an opinion that either agrees with or disagrees with the government. I'm expressing an opinion of fact,
Yes.
and that is a fact.
Uh-huh.
If the government does not believe that we are obliged to be holding elections as a result of a no confidence motion, then the government is at odds with the Constitution.
And the courts.
Yep.
Well, the government has quite correctly and quite legitimately appealed the validity of the vote through the entire court system. That is
Ignoring and therefore setting aside the 90 days or such long a
well,
period.
that is the impact it had, because once you appeal it in the courts, it overtakes the 90 days, and it has. So now it's nearly, 8 months?
Yes.
We're getting on to a year almost since a no confidence motion has been passed. That motion required that we hold general and regional elections. That has been paused, to use the CCJ's terminology. That has been stopped, to use the CCJ's terminology. But the CCJ, in their ruling, made it explicit, or perhaps implicit would be a better word, that from the time that they handed down their ruling, the 3 months came back into play,
Mm-hmm.
which is where the date of September 18th has come
Yeah.
from. Now, that's a constitutional requirement. Why would the private sector commission be involved in that? Because if there's one thing that you need to be certain of when you're conducting business, that is that the rule of law is obeyed and is applied. If the rule of law collapses in the country that you're doing business, you cannot do business properly.
Well, does the fact that the 8 months have passed when there ought to have been just 3 months, does that mean that the rule of law has collapsed?
Not yet, but it may well do so if elections are not held within the prescribed time that the CCJ ruling has set. Now, I heard the Attorney General, when was it, on Monday night?
Yes.
Say that he doesn't know where the September 18th date has come from. He has not recognized that. And I heard Mr. Harmon, I read that Mr. Harmon today said that the government does not necessarily recognize that the cabinet and the president are resigned.
Well, is that a breakdown of the rule of law? If the Constitution is your supreme law,
Indeed.
the interpreter of the Constitution is the court.
So if you're
The
not
highest court has interpreted it.
if you're not recognizing the Constitution and the court is interpreted in a particular way and you're not recognizing the interpretation of the court, then what are you doing?
Yeah. I want to turn back to this question of business. The Minister of Finance today, yesterday, said that, or was reported yesterday, as having said that all this no confidence motion thing has had no impact on the economy, that the economy is continuing to grow at the
Yes,
rate
by over
projected.
4%.
Yes.
But
Is-
growth, we all know that growth rate does not define business in the streets.
Well, it measures economic activity, though.
It does.
It is an economic indicator.
Yes.
It's the production of goods and services in the economy, and so
Over
that seems-
over an extended period of time.
over whatever period of time, that seems to negate the position.
But what is the relationship between a growth rate on an annual basis and the 8 months in which the country has been made to mark time
Well-
since the no confidence motion?
Well, the question is, and Jerry, you comment on this one. We're saying mark time, yet the economy is, 4% is high by international standards. It's certainly high by regional standards, and that includes Latin America.
I think it's admirable.
And you
But-
would recognize what is happening in our oil and gas sector,
Yes.
with the investors, with the exploration going on, and so on. So while we are dealing and grappling with the issue of having to deal with a caretaker government with limited powers according to the CCJ and so on, which in fact is not a good thing for business. We want to have a government that is fully installed and fully instituted and operating with all its powers, so that we could get on with our contracts.
Well, the
and
government
get
will
on.
say that's exactly what they're doing.
A couple of
that
months
is
ago,
not,
the
yeah.
Chamber of Commerce did a research paper amongst the business community about the business activity, and it defined very clearly that business activity is slowed down, and it defined it statistically. That's evidence enough.
Well, the Minister of Finance is the person who heads the Stats Bureau. He heads the Bank of Ghana. Politically, he ought to know as well, shouldn't he?
Yep.
I'm no economist, but I would imagine that the acceleration of economic activity directly concerned with the oil and gas industry
Mm-hmm.
has affected the growth rate
In a positive way.
in a very positive way.
Yes.
But that does not necessarily mean that in the streets that people are spending money.
Yeah.
There's no correlation between the two.
Look. I mean, we gotta accept the fact that Guyana is really on an upswing. There's really a good trajectory forward, and which is good for the Guyanese and good for everybody at this time. And so, while we're going through this challenge of this election period and the issue of a caretaker government, the projections for the future of Guyana looks good, and so there is a sense of confidence in the future. And so other businessmen from across the regions, everybody's looking at Guyana. So it's not a doom and gloom. I don't imagine. I think what is important is that the rule of law, the constitution, the CCJ ruling, and we have a government. And it doesn't matter which government is involved. All we are talking about is the rule of law, and we have a fair and free elections that bring us back to normalcy, so that business could continue.
Yes, and at the moment, and I said it a little while ago, and I say it again, the country is being made to stand still
Mm-hmm.
while we are in a state of flux in which we have a government that itself has recognized that its executive powers to govern are restricted and limited. The president himself has said so. And while that is occurring, such things as major contracts, major forward planning and development activities that abound in contracts, all of those things are being put in a freezer. That cannot be good for the country.
And we stick to business for a couple of minutes more. The minister also seemed to have admitted that we're already suffering the effects of the Dutch disease. Does that worry you? You said yes, we were on this cusp, this upward trajectory. Does it bother you?
Well, I'm not sure what he means by the Dutch disease.
The Dutch disease is where you have growth in one sector of an economy. I'm oversimplifying it for this purpose. And it crowds out or it displaces other sectors. And he particularly mentioned the Lower East Bank Demerara. We know BV, for example. We know that lots of businesses have decided, look, we will just become landlords, rent oil companies. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're talking about the potential impact, the exchange rate from oil and gas, making agriculture, making manufacturing, making even some services
All of that,
uneconomic.
all of that is probably going to happen, but I don't think it bears any relationship to the current situation with regard to the no confidence vote.
No, I'm saying as an economic issue. I'm not linking that. Does that cause the private sector commission
To have a concern.
concern? If at this early stage oil has not started to flow yet, and you've got Dutch disease, and the potential of compounding it with the resource curse, which is a bad governance on top of petroleum, for example, or it could have been copper, it could be mining.
Well, you're now getting into issues such as the Sovereign Wealth Fund, whether the legislation for that has been completed, whether it is operational, whether it's properly written. Those are issues that the private sector has been intimately involved in.
Issues of local content.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the distraction that we are facing with this null, so to speak, in our governance systems is distracting us from dealing. And while we are here grappling with these issues, all the economic issues is also happening outside of our purview, and I think it's something we need to seriously pay attention to.
Well, now, we know there was a vote. It was as clear as day that the majority of a number of 65 is 33. That took over 7 months to have resolved. Are we likely to see this whole business, because the house now, we've gone into another cycle of legal action perhaps, are we likely to see another 7 months in which nothing happens?
There's a simple answer to that. GCOM have provided a written projection of the time frames, work plan for holding house-to-house registration. That projection, it's GCOM's own projection, takes you to the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. What's the implication for that, Jerry?
Well, we are in no man's land after September 18th.
What does that mean?
According to Ralph Ramkaran, it's uncharted waters. And it's interesting to know how what happens after that. I mean, I'm actually surprised and shocked that we are allowing our country to spiral into that zone.
Kit, is this uncharted waters? Did
I'm
we have
not
this
a
in
lawyer,
19...
so I can't tell you that.
No. I wasn't asking you a legal point. I'm asking you a factual point. Did we have something like this in 1978 when elections were due?
No, I mean, we've never been in a situation of this kind.
1978?
78, yes. We were due to have elections in 1978 and they weren't held until 1980.
Was it? We had elections every 4 years, so we had elections in 1970.
Yeah.
No, before.
73, 68, 73,
And, yeah.
78, and we didn't. We had it in the 80.
You know, I didn't recall that, but I was a young man, so that's when we had the referendum.
Well, what were the circumstances then? I mean, you can't just go back into history without
I go back
defining the context.
Well, I go back into history because we are saying it's uncharted waters. It's not quite, in that we've had this before, and you may have been.
But the circumstances were different, and I believe the rule of law was not violated.
By those elections, the 1978 elections, the referendum?
Because there was an intervention, international intervention.
In 78?
When you say international intervention, what do you
Are
mean?
you talking about 78 or are you talking about 1997? During that period, between, I think he's talking about a different period. He's talking about 78 when we had the referendum.
When we ought to have had elections.
And we had a referendum.
And instead, I think he was Prime Minister then.
Right.
Prime Minister Burnham said, no, we'll change the constitution and I need more time. And it took 2 years.
But you can also argue that we had a government that shouldn't have been in office during that period.
Well, that's what I'm
That
saying.
they benefited from rigged elections.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
You can argue all of those things.
Well, I'm not arguing. I'm simply saying that we've in some ways
happened
we've gone
before.
this way. And what was the impact on the economy? I'm coming back to the economy because I see you
But
guys.
The economy was in a mess anyway then.
Is oil going to save us on this occasion? Take oil out of the equation. Where would we have been now?
Looking forward.
Yeah, take oil out of the equation. And for example, if we start accounting, and I have certainly called for our national statistics to separate the oil economy from the non-oil economy,
Yeah.
where would we be?
In what context? In the context of the no confidence
No,
motion?
no,
or
In
no,
terms
no,
of the
no.
economy,
On the economy.
in
the
terms of
context
investor confidence, and
Well, I believe that we were doing quite well until we discovered oil.
That's a paradox, is it?
well, certainly before the no confidence motion. I think the no confidence motion put us into a very uncertain.
That's why I said, are
yeah.
you discussing it in the context?
No,
of the
no, 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 I'm
confidence?
not.
Well, then,
I'm dealing with
setting
it as
aside
a-
the no confidence motion, and what you're asking is, if that hadn't happened, and if oil hadn't been discovered, where would we be?
Yeah.
Well, the economy was I think, progressing reasonably well. Gold was doing
Yes.
extremely well. Forestry was not doing that well. Tourism is beginning to pick up. So I would say that the economy was doing reasonably well, especially if you compare our growth rates in those circumstances with some of the other Caribbean countries, for instance, and indeed in South America. But that's a highly hypothetical question that I don't think really has any relevance to what we are having to deal with today.
Yeah, and I'll come back there and keep my eye on the clock. But it's the Dutch disease is an important factor.
Yes, and from my little knowledge, and I'm not an expert in this area by any means, I don't think the Guyana is going to avoid the Dutch disease, no matter what we do. It will have its impact.
But kid, I think if we had the time to focus on it, to focus on what we need to do, that we need to focus on agriculture, we need to focus on education, on tourism and manufacturing. I think if we understand that those things are also very important and we need to pay attention to them. But what has happened, I think we are so distracted.
Yes.
We are so distracted with these issues, these governance issues, that it's having a very negative effect.
Well, of course, that's why I said the government has been made to stand, not the government, the country
Yes.
has been made to stand still. We're marking time. For 8 months we've been marking time.
And I think what is important is a no confidence motion don't necessarily mean a change of government.
Yes.
A no confidence motion doesn't mean a change of all it means that you go back to elections and the government will either get back a mandate to continue for the next 5 years, but it's an election. And so
When the no confidence motion was passed, we know what happened. It was recognized immediately by the Prime Minister, by the Minister of Foreign Affairs,
And the next day by the president as well.
exactly. And had that continued, we would by now have had an election,
Yes. Yes, indeed.
and it would all be over and done with. Instead of that, because the government decided in their political wisdom, and it was their right to do so, and I would never dispute that, to challenge it through the court system, we've been placed in a difficult position as a nation.
So all a government has
But
to do
we have
is challenge something in court and say, look, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to recognize the vote.
that
of
is
the
very
National
unnerving
Assembly."
for business, I'll tell you that.
I mean, it from a businessman's point of view, it's exceedingly disconcerting.
I want to.
Because you don't really know what's going to happen next.
Yes.
You can't plan. Businesses plan 5 to 10 years ahead. They don't plan for 4 months.
and probably
governments,
more. Yeah.
governments plan for the next election.
Yes.
Business doesn't think that way.
I want to raise one further question, then we'll go into this detailed discussion on the House. This question of what a caretaker government really is. It was referred to by the Chancellor at the Court of Appeal stage. It was referred to by the Caribbean Court of Justice.
Go back to the Esther Pereira case.
Yes. Well, tell our viewers.
What year was that?
97.
Well, it started off in
Well,
1997.
Justice Claudette Singh was then the Chief Justice.
No, she wasn't. She wasn't. She was a.
She wa- was she
no, she was a
acting?
High Court judge. She was. Justice Claudette Singh was never a Chief Justice of Guyana.
But she ruled on the matter.
Absolutely, she was the.
Right,
She was
it came to her.
Yes, yes.
And we were without a government for a short period of time.
She clearly outlined what a
And
caretaker
she
government meant.
defined very clearly, it's there in black and white, what a caretaker government is and is not. She didn't use the term caretaker government. And it is very interesting that the same personage is now the chairperson of GCOM. All we need to do is to go back and see what she said.
Well,
And I'm hoping somebody will publish that soon. Perhaps you, Chris.
I probably will.
She was very clear in her ruling on that matter.
Oh, it was explicit. It was almost like the consequential orders by
Correct.
by the CCJ. Bullet points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
But
and 6.
basically what she said, to sum it up, is that the executive authority of the cabinet is restricted.
Yes,
They had no executive authority.
yes.
The president remains in office.
And in her case, it was not a no confidence motion.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes,
But the ministers continue.
yes.
The day-to-day business of government continues.
In a limited fashion.
Yes. She even went so far as to say that the state-owned media
That's correct.
are restricted.
And if the government wanted story anything in the state-owned media, they must do it by way of advertisements.
That is correct. So it was very clearly spelled out there. And I believe that our government needs to respect that. And I'm disappointed when you hear the Attorney General and then Mr. Harmon, what is he now, General Secretary,
Director General.
Director General, say that
Which doesn't give him any political role, and he's functioning in a political. It's a complete farce.
well, he's reporting on cabinet meetings.
Okay.
That's what he's doing.
Yeah.
He sits in the cabinet even though he's not a minister.
Yeah.
But that is his, I think, his professional right.
No, the
And-
president can invite anyone to
Right.
cabinet meetings under the
And he's still
Constitution.
reporting on it. But you're going to go on getting these interpretations from one
Is it
legal side
is
or
it
the
really
other.
healthy for a democracy when just about everything is parsed and analyzed, and the spirit of democracy, the whole convention of how one behaves in a parliamentary democracy, when those things are set aside?
Let's simplify it. You have a no confidence motion against you. You've lost it. Therefore, you are required to go back to the polls. There's a period of time for doing that. You cannot govern in the way you governed before.
Yeah.
Simple.
All right. Let's get to this business of the house-to-house registration. Jerry, is a house-to-house registration one, necessary, two, legal, and three, compatible with the CCJ ruling? So that's three.
Well, I would just like to talk about the necessity part of it. And in terms of the legal part and the part of the CCJ, I'd allow maybe Kit and yourself to deal with that. But I want to say to you,
I ask questions. on
yes,
this program.
I understand. But in terms of necessity, let me tell you, in 1998, we made a decision of the country to have the last
Who is we?
GCOM and the stakeholders, because GCOM made a decision to go to biometrics
Yes.
in 1998. So they got the technology from an example from Jamaica, they brought it to Guyana, and the decision was taken to scrap the old NRR, which was done in a very rudimentary.
Is that 1998 or 2008?
2008. Sorry,
Okay.
2000. Let me correct that. In 2008, because going into the 2006 elections, the PNC said they wanted a system to verify the voters list, to make sure there's no duplicates in the list. And so a system was used then, but then in 2008, this decision was taken to completely redo a new NRR with
National Register
a
of
registrants,
Registrants.
correct, with biometrics.
You mean you need to make the distinction because the ordinary person doesn't
I'm coming.
know the difference between the
I'm coming.
national registration
I'm coming.
and the voters list.
And so-
I think he's going to get there, yes.
And so a decision was taken to scrap the old NRR and to do a completely new one using high-tech technology,
Yes.
right? So the biometrics came in where every voter, every registrant had to give all 10 of their fingerprints. We were registering people from 14 years old in the schools, and we did a complete house-to-house registration in 2008. And at the time, it was meant to be the last time we will do it, because from here on, you now have the technology of biometrics. People face change, but people fingerprints don't change. And every time you scan the voter, the NRR, if there's any duplicate, it knocks out the duplicate. It identifies it, and then we made a decision to go to continuous registration,
Yes.
so that you capture everybody who you might not have gotten at home: the pilots, the loggers, the miners, the Amerindians, people traveling in and out
yes,
of Guyana.
it is periodic.
That's correct. So every year they had 2 or 3 cycles of registration, and you had the periods of the cycles of claims and objections, which meant that it was constantly, the NRR was continuously being renewed. It was a dynamic database.
What about this thing, Jerry, about the persons who are 14 years old are not on the list?
No, that is total misinformation. During
That
the
was said
cycles,
by the president.
somebody misinformed the president. During the cycles of registration, the GCOM was going into the schools and registering 14-year-old children.
Yeah,
And
but
so
how-
when they become 18, this technology, this is a $600,000 US database that Guyana bought, that will now move the child on the 18th birthday from just the NRR onto the voters list. Automatically. So when the time comes for you to pull out, when election is identified, you pull out the PLE, which is the preliminary voters list. You pull out everybody 18 and above, which includes all the 14-year-olds that would have become 18 at that point in time. Now, any 14-year-old or any child or any person that missed the registration cycle could get on it the next time. And so the NRR is constantly being renewed. The integrity of the NRR is protected with fingerprints, and also the picture of every person. Do you know that our national ID cards have 3 photographs? There are 3 photographs on the national ID card of the person. So you have 2 in front and 1 at the back. And in the national database is your fingerprints. So if you went to GCOM, unfortunately GCOM don't have a fingerprint readers yet, because really and truly, if they install a fingerprint reader, you're just going to put your fingerprint in and all your biodata will come up on the screen. So, but what happens if you go there to put your name in, it comes up, and if they want your fingerprint, it comes up. So the point is that the National Register of Registrants database is a high-tech database that the integrity is beyond question.
And it's self-renewing.
And it's self-renewing because you have the continuous registration.
It's self-renewing. What about persons who are dead? You know, the president is concerned about this blow.
Every month, the registry office, by procedure and statute, right, would send all of the dead people, the list of the dead people, to GCOM, and GCOM would clean the list. Now, Loingfield was part of this system since that happened.
That's the chief elections officer.
The chief elections officer. In fact, he was a deputy at the time, but he was very much involved in it. And we constantly would meet GCOM. We meet the chairman of GCOM. We meet Loingfield's always being there, and always you would hear that the list goes from the registry office to GCOM, where they would clean the list on a monthly basis with the dead people. Mind you, people who might have gone overseas and died, maybe they might not have had those people.
Yes.
Right? But the issue is that constantly the list was cleansed, constantly there are people coming off the list, and new people are being added during the period of continuous registration. The integrity of this list, to ensure that there's no duplicates on this list, is when every time they scan this list, and people don't know this, but GCOM need to, this list is then packaged and sent overseas for scanning. This list is not scanned in Guyana. The GCOM will have to tell us how that happens, but that list leaves Guyana, the database, goes overseas, and is scanned and cleansed and brought back to Guyana. So that the scanning for the duplicate fingerprints and any anomalies and updates in the software happens not inside of Guyana but outside of Guyana.
So am I right in saying, deducing from what you said, is that, look, the list in fact is self-cleaning as well?
This is the NRR,
The National
Register of Registrants,
yeah.
yes.
And
From which
from
the
which-
voters
the
list
preliminary
is
voters list.
extracted.
Well, what would happen when election is called, then they go to the NRR and they extract the PLE, the preliminary voters list. That preliminary voters list is then put up all over the place for claims and objections. At the end of that, a voters list is then produced. That voters list is only good for 6 months, and that is the list that expired in April. The voters list that was extracted from the NRR. Now, what is dangerous of what we are doing, which is unnecessary, if you went back to house registration, what you're in fact making a decision to do is to scrap the current NRR, and out of every Guyanese with their ID cards on that who would register are now going to be disenfranchised. You have to go back through that whole process. You're destroying billions of dollars that was spent during the continuous cycles of registration, producing of ID cards, capturing a lot of people who were not home during house registration, and now you're scrapping it. You're scrapping a totally scientifically accurate NRR.
In fact, the enumerators have come into homes, we know this is a fact, and have said your ID card is no longer valid. You can't even show me that to say who you are. They have said that
So that has implications for banking and all of these things.
huge implications.
You're in fact scrapping you're scrapping the current NRR if you did that.
But
I mean,
but,
it really makes no sense.
but you can't just remove somebody from the voters list
Or from the NRR.
or from the NRR. By
There's a
just-
legal process.
Now, let me ask you this. You're
But
saying...
if you're not in the home when they come, let me give you an example. They've done my area, but I was away, so
Mhm.
I haven't been registered.
Okay.
So I'm off the voters list. I'm off the NRR.
Right.
There are going to be numerous examples of that kind. And if you're overseas, if you're on holiday,
Or if you're a pilot and you're not at home.
or in fact, if you're not even living here, you are entitled, if you're living
An ID card.
overseas and you're
You're a
registered,
Guyanese, yes, yes.
you're entitled to come home and vote.
That's right.
There's a reason of the list as well. If we have 750,000 people in Guyana, and the NRR got 600 and something thousand, then what is important to note, in 2015, the voters list had 570,000 people.
Yes.
In 2018, it had 573,000. So it's only 3,000 more.
Yes, yeah.
Now, the reason that you might have an NRR with 600,000 people is not only because you have the 40-year-olds in there. It is also because many people who were not being captured in a regular house-to-house
Yes.
were captured during the continuous cycles of registration. People coming back home, and nothing disqualifies a Guyanese living overseas from registering.
There's one other quick point I want to make on that. The Constitution itself
We got 1 minute more.
recognizes the fact that there's continuous registration. That is why the Constitution recognizes that GCOM has to be ready and
Always
prepared to hold an election within 3 months of being required to do so.
Correct.
That would be impossible if you didn't have continuous registration.
My final question then. If that is so, Jerry, and you're saying you have personal knowledge of all of this going back decade and more, so does Vincent Alexander. Why is he taking a different position? 30 seconds.
Vincent Alexander need to publicly...
He's a commissioner.
Yeah. Vincent Alexander, I believe, agreed that the list there could be a verification process of the list and could move the elections.
And so did the legal officer.
And so did Lowenfield.
Yes. Kit, you want a final word?
You're asking me the same question.
Final word, yes.
I would make it very simple. Vincent Alexander is a politician.
On that note, operators, viewers, thank you. Good night. See you next week.